The design, exactly the design. So don't think that's mine. I'm not that creative. Okay. Skin House. Cold skin caressed Ron awake. Let me know how the music is, just in case it's too quiet or too loud. He glanced towards the mottled hand draped across the pillow, squeezed his eyes closed, and rolled away from it. The fingers twitched, seemingly beckoning him back. He dipped his feet over the edge of the bed. Something scraped his toes as he slid them inside his slippers, and he recoiled with a barely muffled gasp. He turned the shoes over, and a dozen human molars clattered to the floor. Some rolled under the bed, others glittered on the polished wood. He considered not wearing the slippers, then resolutely pulled them over his feet and went to the bathroom. If you relent, you lose. 3 human fingers lay in the toothbrush holder. He ignored them as he took out his brush, even though one of them curled over at his touch. Ron watched his own face as he scrubbed his teeth. Human skin had been stretched over the wall behind him, and it pulsed from the effects of a non-existent heart. But he didn't stare at it. If you give it attention, you lose. The shower had hair tangled in its shower head. He tried pulling it free, but it had been woven through the tiny holes and refused to come out. Showering would still be possible, but it would mean letting the long, wet curls brush across his back. It was too much, even for him. He dressed and went downstairs. A human head stared at him from the second shelf of his fridge. It had been there the day before, too, and the mottled skin seemed to be puckering from where the refrigerated air was drying it. The blanched white eyes twitched to follow his movements as he retrieved leftover pizza. The flesh was blackening around the severed neck, and rotting fluids seeped from its open mouth. But he ignored it. He knew what was happening. It had happened to his mother, too. She'd been consigned to the madhouse before his 8th birthday, where she incessantly screamed about her blankets being made of human flesh and fingernails scratching over her legs as she sat in her chair. Insanity. If you give in to it, you lose. You go to the madhouse. You scream until you die. Ron sat at the small kitchen table and ate his pizza. A dismembered tongue rested among the stack of unopened letters, its moisture soaking into and discoloring the paper. Unlike his mother, he was holding it together. He'd inherited her insanity, but he'd learned from her mistakes, too. He wouldn't go shrieking to his neighbors about human body parts littering his home. As long as he kept his experiences to himself, the men in white coats would have no reason to visit. Will it eventually go away, or will it be like this forever? Something wet dripped into his hand. He refused to look towards the ceiling. He didn't want to see what was seeping onto him. Instead, he dried his fingers on a tissue and shifted the chair a foot to the left. I'm not sure how long I can keep this up. It had started a week previously, when he'd found a severed toe on his living room floor. He'd almost called the police over it, except the toe had twitched. That clue had told him it was all in his head. If he called the police, they would come, and when he pointed at the twitching member, they would see nothing. And so he had to keep quiet about it. He had to ignore the steadily growing collection of human parts appearing around his home, to not let anyone suspect that he was cracking apart inch by inch. It was Monday. He would need to be at the school in an hour to welcome his class. The previous Friday, just before leaving for the day, he'd found an error in his drawer. He'd managed to squash any reaction that would alert his students, but he was dreading what he might find there that morning. How bad will it get? There's more of it every day. Will my home eventually turn into nothing but an unholy collection of human fragments? He shook his head and closed his eyes. No. These images, these smells, these sensations, they're all in your head. They're not real, no matter how real they seem. You can endure, just don't crack. Don't let anyone know. Faint, sing-song chimes ran through the hallway. Ron stood and turned toward the door. He could see a uniformed figure through the frosted glass. A delivery man, young and cradling a parcel, waited outside. Stay calm. Stay normal. Ron approached the door then recoiled as his feet landed in something soft. The skin from a human's torso was draped over the hallway runner. He'd squashed it just above the belly button. It took immense willpower not to make a noise. He kept moving, stepping over the flesh and reaching for the door handle. Smile, Ron, he coached himself and exposed his teeth as he pulled open the door. Mr. Kilbourne? The delivery man asked, holding out his clipboard. A parcel for... What the hell? Ron followed the man's gaze. He was looking inside the apartment, his jaw slack and his eyes bulging as he stared at the pulsing flesh-covered carpet. Oh, Ron said, uncertain whether to laugh or cry. Do you see it too? And there we go. That was Skin House. So very good news for the protagonist. His house is just haunted. He's not crazy, you know? I think we could all appreciate that. All right. Does anyone know what happened to the Discord? Oh, so moving forward, I guess people just decided to go separate ways. It was kind of a burden anyway. So that one is closed down. We do have a new one. If I'm halfway intelligent, I do have the new one linked in the description. If that's not the right one, somebody tell me so that I could change it. But yeah, there we go. Okay, let's see. Okay, an empty church it is. I'll go ahead and end the poll. Thanks for voting, everybody that voted. An empty church. What do you think it is? Clara asked, then corrected herself. Was. Church. Sam nodded toward the cross adorning the deeply slanted roof. Must be old, though. I didn't think anyone lived near here. Clara turned to glance at the trees behind them. They'd been crossing from the town to Sam's house using the Potts Forest as a shortcut. When they'd become lost. Not that being lost in Potts Forest was dangerous. The woods were crisscrossed with hiking trails and roads. All the friends needed to do was keep walking until they came across a pathway, then follow it back to town. Neither of them had been expecting to find signs of habitation in the forest, though. Want to look inside? Sam grinned, and her braces reflected in the low afternoon light. Clara sighed. Really? Come on, yeah. Let's see what's left inside. The church wasn't large. It was smaller than Clara's house, even. Sam was first to the door, and she pushed it open, then wiped her hands on her jeans. It's slimy. Wood's rotting, Clara noted. Better be careful in there. Sam made a mocking noise. It's not that derelict, come on. Inside the church was so dim that Clara had to squint to make out the shapes. Rows of ancient carved wooden pews faced the front of the church, where a simple pulpit stood below a stained glass window. Clara blinked at the image in the glass, but it didn't seem to be any sort of religious scene. It showed a gigantic snake coiled in on itself, its mouth swallowing its tail so that it became a circle. The serpent's teeth pierced its own scales, sending rivulets of blood onto the black ground below it. Clara shuddered and turned away. Well, we know what that's called. That's an Ouroboros, I believe, right? I mean, anyone that's seen Full Metal Alchemist. Let's see. Commotion. A communion table stood at the front of the church, its once white crocheted cloth discolored and tatty from age. Clara approached the table and looked over the ornaments. There were no communion cups or baskets for bread. Instead, a range of ornate, decadently twisting knives were laid out on the stained cloth, and a large bowl stood in the center of the table. The bowl's contents had dried during the decades the church had been forgotten, but it had left a black sediment in the base. Clara found herself imagining a congregation lining up to slice their hands and mingle their blood in the bowl. She forced herself to look away. This place is too weird. Sam? Ready to go? Clara hoped she'd kept the anxiety out of her voice, but she couldn't stop it thundering through her veins as she looked about the room and saw she was alone. Sam? No answer. Clara crossed her hands over her chest and tried to slow her breathing. She moved to the center of the church and looked up and down the rows of pews. A door, one she couldn't remember seeing before, stood open below the stained glass window. Clara squinted at it. She thought she could hear faint noises coming from the darkness. Halting, stumbling footsteps and shoes scraping across the stone floor. Clara reluctantly approached the door and held her breath to listen to the sounds. The footsteps mingled with a voice, but the sound was too low for her to understand what it was saying. She glanced down and saw the dust had been wiped off the door handle. Someone had gone that way recently. Clara cleared her throat, but her voice still came out as a whisper. Sam? Yes, Clara? Sam's voice, placid, came from inside the doorway. Sam, get out of there. I want to go. Silence. Clara leaned into the doorway, hoping to see her... I think my phone is going off, damn it. Hang on. You know what? Give me like 1 second. I'll reread the last paragraph. My bad. Okay, we're fine. Everything's good. Don't worry about it. Okay. Let's see. Sam, get out of there. I want to go. Silence. Clara leaned into the doorway, hoping to see her companion. The faint light from the church's entrance and the holes in the roof... I unmuted it, right? Yeah, okay, good. The faint light from the church's entrance and the holes in the roof couldn't illuminate more than the first few steps, but she could see a stone stairwell leading downwards. Does the church have a basement? Sam? Clara called again, but there was still no response. Clara steeled herself, then stepped over the threshold and into the stairwell. Almost immediately, the darkness engulfed her. Let's see... Making her hang on. Okay, we're good, sorry. I keep hearing... I'm sure it's somebody outside. Almost immediately, the darkness engulfed her, making her feel cloistered and smothered. She tried to draw breath, but it felt like inhaling water. She tried to call, but her voice stuck in her throat. Moving her feet felt like dragging her limbs through the mud, but she moved forward slowly and deliberately as the blackness pressed in on her from all sides. Panic rose through her chest as she tried to call again and found her voice choked. She turned back to find the door, but all was darkness. She couldn't see the light, she couldn't see the door, and she couldn't see Sam. She tried to scream, but the sound was doused before it could even reach her own ears. I'm suffocating. Even though she was still dragging breaths into her lungs, it felt nothing like any sort of air she'd inhaled before. Dead and heavy, it made her want to retch. She flung herself forward, towards where she thought the door had been, but her fingers grazed only the air. Her feet slipped out from under her as she fell forward. She braced herself to hit the floor, but instead, she slammed into the door, upright. Clara took a stumbling half-step back, but didn't dare take her fingers away from the doorframe. She scrabbled over it, searching for the handle and a way out as she fought to inhale the toxic substance that threatened to drown her. A choking sob escaped her raw throat, but the sound was perfectly smothered. She couldn't hear a thing, not her heartbeat, not the sounds of her fingernails splintering as she clawed at the door with increased desperation, and not the sounds of her hungry, futile gasps. Then the door swung open on its own, and Clara stumbled through it. She was back in the forest, facing the path she and Sam had been following. She drew a sharp, gasping breath, relieved to feel real air in her lungs again. When she turned, she found the church just behind her, its front door wide open. That's impossible. She rotated to see the forest again and caught sight of a figure near the edge of the trees. She recognized the jeans and slightly too large sweater and stumbled towards her friend. Sam? Sam turned slowly. Her face was sheet white and coated with sweat, and her eyes, normally a bright brown, were deadened, as though she'd seen things Clara couldn't even dream of. Sam? Clara repeated, grabbing at her friend's arm. Sam blinked at her once and drew a shuddering breath. I want to go home. And that is the end of An Empty Church. I gotta say, I liked that one. That is exactly up my alley for horror. That felt like a creepypasta. In fact, that's got a lot of similarities to a creepypasta I read years ago. It was about a weird church that everyone had forgotten, and two kids go in and start exploring it. Yeah, good stuff. Okay, here we go. Beanie's fast food. Beanie's plastic eyes surveyed the restaurant as his wide smile stretched his rosy cheeks. Polly always made a point of tapping. Oh, it is tapping. Polly always made a point of tapping the bright yellow button on Beanie's suit whenever he passed, as though the giant plastic torso could bring him the good luck. He did so then as he crossed to the door at the back of the restaurant, two garbage bags clenched in his other fist. He could hear Jen, Polly's co-worker, grumbling as she sorted the inventory in the walk-in fridge. She hated the closing shift almost as much as Polly did. He shoved through the narrow door at the back of the building and used one foot to slow its closing so that it would hit the latch but not lock. The cold night air bit at his face and ears. He jogged towards the dumpsters at the opposite side of the car park, trying to keep up his momentum and reminding himself that he would be home in another 20 minutes. Polly was halfway across the car park when a bang startled him. He turned, surveying the nearby streets, which were empty. The parking lot had only 3 cars. His, Jen's, and another he didn't recognize. The car possibly belonged to a druggie or a drunk who'd forgotten where he'd parked. It had happened before. Their branch of Beanie's fast food was nestled on the edge of a not-so-pleasant part of town. Train lines ran behind the parking lot, and every half an hour a carriage would whistle past, drowning out their customers' voices. The slums on the other side of the tracks housed some of the strangest people Polly had ever met, and he'd met his fair share of weirdos. He couldn't count the number of employees as his boss, Jacob, had fired. He couldn't count the number of employees his boss Jacob had fired, and for far more extreme reasons than he'd ever anticipated. Selling drugs over the counter was a common one, but 2 cooks had been let go for trying to deep fry a rat. And one employee had tried to gouge out a customer's eye. Some days, Polly felt as if he, Jen, and Jacob were the only sane people left in the world. Polly pushed the dumpster's lid open and threw the bags inside. "Nearly the end of your shift, buddy," he reminded himself as he turned back to the store's sooty back entrance. "Then you get to enjoy opening shift tomorrow, too. Hooray." The street lamps spaced around the car park left stark circles of light on the black asphalt. Polly didn't like walking through them and skirted around their edges, eager to get inside the relatively warm eatery. He hesitated at the door. It was pulled tightly closed. Must have been the wind? That could have been what the slamming noise was. The door was being forced closed. Muttering under his breath, Polly unlocked the door and pushed inside. The back areas were far less orderly and clean than they kept the parts of the kitchen visible to the public, but between himself and Jen, they managed to stop it from getting too disgusting. Polly could still hear Jen in the walk-in fridge, muttering to herself as she counted off inventory and made a list for Jacob to reorder goods the following morning. Polly grabbed the broom from the corner of the room and returned to the front of the store, where the floor was permanently in need of cleaning. He raised a hand to tap Bernie's bright gold button out of habit, then pulled his hand back as he touched something wet. What the hell? A red substance had been smeared across the plastic mascot's neck, connecting one ear to the other in a gory replica of a cut throat. The substance had dribbled over the torso, including the button Polly liked to tap. Polly's mouth felt dry. He stared at the mascot, too confused to feel proper shock. "I was only outside for a couple of minutes. Who could have done this? Not Jen, surely." As if on cue, Jen rounded the corner and stopped short at the sight of the defaced statue. Her eyes roved from the red splatter to Polly's tinted fingertips, and a scowl settled above her dark eyes. "What the hell, Polly?" The shocked indignation in her voice convinced Polly that she had no knowledge of the vandalism. That was enough to shake him out of his stupor, and he took a step back, feeling revolted. "Wasn't me," he said. He pressed his thumb against the red liquid on his index finger, trying to guess its origin based on its viscousness. As he rubbed his fingers together, the substance began to dry and tack in the way only one thing could. Blood. "Don't be an ass," Jen snapped, moving closer to the mascot. She squinted at the stains, seeming reluctant to touch them. "I mean, it looks like it, but I thought I heard the door slam," Polly said as the memory came back to him. "When I was taking the trash out." "That wasn't you?" Jen's eyes scoured his face, testing his truthfulness. Then she swore under her breath and pulled out her phone. "If this is really blood... Geez, I'm calling Jacob. I'm not paid enough to deal with this sort of crap." Polly couldn't stop staring at the mascot. The blood had been smeared deliberately to replicate a cut throat. Is that a threat? Who'd want to threaten us? Could be a dismissed employee, I guess, or maybe a customer who really hated their food? A strange, haunting jingle came from farther in the store. Both Polly and Jen swung towards it. From what Polly could tell, its source was somewhere near the back of the dining room. It's the boss's phone, Jen said, taking her mobile away from her ear and glancing about the shadowed eatery. He's still here. Polly remembered the third car left beside his and Jen's in the parking lot. It had been too deep in the shadows to see clearly, but it could have been Jacob's. Come on, Jen said, pushing past Polly to cross the dining area. I'm not going to stand for any sick pranks. Her voice was strong, but he thought he detected a note of anxiety hidden in it. He followed her as the haunting jingle led them to the bathrooms at the back of the building. The ringtone came from the men's, and Jen pushed in without hesitation. "Jacob?" she called, and to her credit she hesitated only a second before striding towards the stalls. "What the hell do you think you're playing at?" Polly froze in the doorway, his nerves on fire and the hair on his arms standing on end. Only one stall had its door closed, the last one in the row. It wasn't fully shut, though. The door had been pulled to, but not locked. "Jen," Polly said, and the word rasped across his dry lips. "Jen, don't." She either ignored him or hadn't heard him, just like she hadn't heard the dripping sound, barely audible above Jacob's ringtone, or seen the trickle of dark blood running from inside the stall and dribbling towards the drain. Jen pushed open the stall door, and her scowl morphed into an expression of absolute terror. And that's it. Boy, kinda leaves it on a cliffhanger, doesn't it? I hate that. I mean, I can understand why, but don't end it right as the climax is about to happen, You didn't finish the Amnesia game. Yeah, I don't finish many games, it seems. Room for rent. The sun was close to the horizon when Henrik slowed his car outside the stone cottage, the unassuming two-story building with its garden of hardy shrubs and winter-dormant rose bushes blended into the village's old-world charm. Not for the first time that day, he wondered if the buildings had been deliberately designed that way to lure tourists. The board available sign in the window had caught Henrik's attention. He'd planned his trip across the country expecting to spend the night in the remote village and had been surprised to find it didn't seem to have any sort of hotel or motel. The nearest town was 4 hours away, and he was eager to get some food and sleep. Henrik, I wonder if it's Heinrich. There's no I in the, Henrik parked off the side of the narrow dirt road. Unless there was a shed or garage out the back, the cottage's owner didn't seem to have a car, just 2 bikes propped against the shadowed porch. Henrik cast a final glance back at the town, its gold lights glittering across the hill, then began climbing the steps. "What you doing there?" a voice asked, and Henrik jumped. He hadn't seen the boy sitting in the old wooden chair at the back corner of the porch, and an embarrassed flush crept over his face. I need a place to stay the night." The boy's eyes darted over Henrik's face as a cold smile drew his lips apart. "Oh, really?" Henrik hesitated, suddenly feeling uncomfortable. He was spared answering when the cottage's door swung open and a heavy-set woman with a wide, reddish face leaned through the frame. "What? Sam, are you scaring the guests off again?" she asked the boy. He lurched out of his chair and skulked past the woman and into the house. It wasn't until Sam stood that Henrik realized he'd underestimated the boy's age. Based on his height, he had to be at least in his mid-teens. The woman turned to Henrik and gave him a sad, apologetic smile. "Sorry about him, love. He doesn't mean any harm. Were you looking for a place to stay tonight?" Henrik hesitated for a second. "What's the alternative? Sleep in the car?" "Yes, please. How much?" "20 for just the room." the woman said, glancing Henrik up and down as though to assess his worth. "Or 30 for dinner and breakfast included." "I'll take that," Henrik said, fishing his wallet out of his pocket and sorting through the contents for $30. "It's been a long day. I'm Henrik, by the way." "Barb." The woman took them. Oh my god, that little kid was Chris. The woman took Barb. The woman took the money and ushered him inside with a wide smile. This time, Henrik hesitated for only a half second before crossing the threshold. Let's see. Henrik wasn't sure whether Barb was trying to apologize for her son's behavior or if it was normal for her to spend so much effort on their evening meals, but the dinner table was so laden with food that he could barely see the surly boy slouched opposite. "Eat up," Barb urged Henrik, then turned to her son and added, "Don't fuss with your food like that. How do you expect to grow up properly if you don't eat?" The boy cast his mother an angry frown, then settled his attention on their guest. Henrik tried to focus on the food, which really was delicious, but the boy's eyes were darker than ink and felt almost hypnotic as they focused on him. It was the sort of stare he could have felt without even realizing he had company, and Henrik's skin developed goosebumps in response. He and Barb managed a smattering of small talk, which was more for politeness' sake than enjoyment. Henrik explained that he was traveling through the country to visit family, and Barb told him how her parents and grandparents had lived in their house for generations. Wait a minute. Okay. All the while, the child, Henrik reminded himself, scraped his fork across his plate without eating any of the food. "We don't get so many tourists through here," Barb said, trying to push an extra serving of green beans onto Henrik's plate despite his objections. "But it's always nice when we do. We're in no position to turn down the money, are we, Sam?" Sam, unblinking, opened his mouth and exhaled a breathy chuckle. Henrik frowned at him. He couldn't possibly be suffering from a mental condition, could he? Insanity at such a young age? Barb didn't seem happy at her son's response, and she scowled at his plate. "Eat. Why are you always so picky about your food? You'll grow up looking like a skeleton." Again, the boy's mouth opened, and this time his laughter, harsh, furious, and mournful all at once, rang in Henrik's ears. "Enough," Barb said, dropping her cutlery beside her plate and pulling her son out of his chair. "If you can't behave when we have company over, you can eat in your room." The boy's face turned murderous, and for a second Henrik was afraid he was about to hit his mother. But then he turned, slouched through the doorway, and disappeared into the shadowed room beyond. Very clearly embarrassed, Barb sighed and brushed a strand of hair out of her round face. "I am so sorry." Henrik waved away her apology as casually as he could. Raising a child with mental issues in the middle of the countryside seemed an insurmountable task. The town didn't appear to even have a proper hospital, just a single doctor's surgery he'd passed near the town's outskirts. Barb gave him a tight smile. "Well, if you've had enough, shall I show you to your room?" Upstairs was dark to the point of being dingy. Henrik placed his suitcase on the end of the narrow quilt-covered bed and began sorting through it for his nightclothes. The lamps set into the walls were in desperate need of cleaning, and they sent heavy shadows about the room. There was at least 3 months' worth of dust on every surface. Barb tapped on the doorway to announce her presence, then entered, carrying a bundle of quilts. "In case you get cold tonight, she said, settling them beside Henrik's luggage. She hesitated, then added, "Just so you know, I've locked Sam in his room for tonight." "Oh?" Henrik glanced up from the luggage to see Barb was facing the bedroom window. She had a sad, drawn look about her eyes, and he turned away, not wanting to embarrass her. "Yes, he has problems with people staying here. It's my fault. We need the money, so I don't turn anyone away. But he hates it now that he understands it. I forgot to lock his door one night, and he saw me carrying the body out back to bury it. He's never really been the same since." The quilt dropped from Henrik's hand. "What?" He didn't even have time to turn before the garrote slipped around his neck. All right, what a twist. I can't believe I actually managed to say Garrett the proper way. But that's the problem. Nobody understands when you say garrote. They're all like, oh, a garrote. But I think garrote is the proper way to pronounce it. Oh my god. Burger King foot lettuce. Number 9. I should read this entire story in that voice. Holy shit. Beanie's plastic eyes surveyed the restaurant as his wide smile stretched his rosy cheeks. I can't do that. I would die. You would die. It would curse the whole stream.